How have discourses surrounding terrorism and practices of counter-terrorism worked to systematically alienate, exclude, or discriminate against groups of people? Perhaps no other social act is more polarizing, and for good reason, than terrorism. It's truly horrifying, harmful, and tragic. But what are the consequences of using terrorism and counter-terrorism as a way to alienate, exclude, and possibly target vulnerable groups? On this episode of the Sociology of Terrorism, we're talking about terrorism and social othering. So sit back, grab a snack, and let's get started. Since 9/11, and accelerated after the Madrid Train bombings in 2005 and the July 7th London bombings in 2005, terrorism discourse and counterterrorism policies and practices have been critiqued for focusing almost exclusively on a particular kind of terrorist activity. Media, politicians, state representatives, and even scholars have broadly focused on the emergence, development, and activities of so-called Islamic fundamentalist terrorist groups. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, Islam-related terrorism was the central antagonist in the United States' much maligned war on terror. Groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and places like Afghanistan and Iraq, were ingrained into the social psyche as being synonymous with terrorism that threatens the so-called Western world. As a corollary, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, North American and European state and non-state actors created a narrative that terrorism is a threat from supposedly out there, that it is a threat primarily to be understood as an international and foreign one, committed by individuals and groups who want to explicitly target the neoliberal democratic way of life. And the formation of this narrative was a highly successful socio-political project. Media, politicians, government officials, and scholars were all part of a project that simultaneously framed non-Western discourses, ideologies, and beliefs as supposedly alien others, whilst reinforcing a sense of nationalism and patriotism amongst its own citizens. According to Gallup polling, following the attacks in Washington and New York, over 70% of Americans reported that they were extremely proud to be American. Compare that to between 45 and 80% that it is today. Then President George W. Bush's approval rating went from 51% to over 90% almost overnight in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Public support for military intervention in Afghanistan, and then ultimately in Iraq, was as high as 90 and 80% respectively. Since the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978, much academic discourse has used the term Orientalism to refer to a general patronizing attitude towards Middle Eastern, Asian, and North African societies and their cultures. In Said's analysis, the West essentializes these societies, meaning that it treats them as intrinsically static and underdeveloped, thereby fabricating a view of Oriental culture that can be studied, depicted, and reproduced in the service of imperial settler colonial power. Part of this fabrication, Said argues, is the idea that Western society is this well-developed, rational, flexible, and superior place that is more civilized than others. Orientalism refers to this problematic approach to what Said calls the Orient, in which the Occident, or the Western world, depicts the Orient, or the Eastern world, through this problematic lens. For example, in history as in art, the Western world often represents Eastern cultures through very specific tropes, stereotypes, and worldviews that form the basis of public understanding of the Eastern world. Think of the way in which Disney films, for instance, represent characters who are supposed to represent the Eastern world. These shape public understandings. These have a real and tangible effect. For Said, Orientalism is used to describe a pervasive Western tradition, academic, cultural, political, and even artistic, of prejudiced outsider interpretations of the Eastern world, which was shaped by the cultural attitudes of European imperialism and settler colonialism in the 18th and 19th centuries. The thesis of Orientalism builds on Antonio Gramsci's theories of hegemony and Foucault's theorizations of discursive formations to criticize the scholarly tradition of Oriental studies. Said criticized contemporary scholars who perpetuated the tradition of outsider interpretations of Arab and Islamic cultures. And this is especially so when you consider the case of our approaches to terrorism. Said, as did others like Abd al-Malek, warned us about the hegemonic power of the West, who are able to legitimate and confirm their centrality, importance, and exceptionalism against so-called others of the Eastern world. Indeed, if we look back at the 9/11 attacks, we can now acknowledge that they were not a solely and entirely unprecedented consequence of the highest stage of political, economic, and cultural imperialism, but perhaps part of a longer history of geopolitical intervention, foreign policy, expansion of the military-industrial complex, and the cultural misrepresentations of the Eastern world. An example of this rhetoric is Samuel Huntington's infamous class of civilizations thesis, which suggests that people's cultural and religious identities are the primary source of conflict in the post-Cold War world. The American political scientist Samuel Huntington argued that future wars would be fought not between countries, but between cultures. Huntington maintains that trends of global conflict since the World War are increasingly appearing at what he called civilizational divisions, or divisions between Western political systems and cultural ideals centered on advanced capitalist democratization, distinguished from East Asian cultures and political structures. For Huntington, the Western world's reluctance to accept that universal norms centered on these ideals will only antagonize other so-called civilizations and cause further conflict. For Huntington, the powers in the Western world refuse to accept this because they're the ones who built the international globalized system, passed its laws, and gave it substance in the form of the United Nations. Huntington identifies a major shift in economic, military, and political power from the West to other civilizations of the world, most significantly to what he identifies as the two quote-unquote challenger civilization, what he calls East Asian Cynic and Islam. Each of these represent attempts to culturally assert values on the Western world through economic growth. In the zero-sum game of geopolitics, these so-called civilizations are trying to assert themselves as the global hegemon, and therefore threaten Western interests. As you can see, this thesis promotes a very problematic idea of cultural determinism, that entire cultures can be reduced to one specific essential feature, as if cultures are static, universal, and homogeneous entities, and diversity is not a central feature of all cultures, including Western liberal democracies. Promoting the idea that cultures are vacuumous entities that inevitably clash with one another is to promote a set of exclusionary and divisive worldviews. In other words, work like this explicitly contributes to the Orientalist logic that has framed Western perceptions of the Eastern world. Edward Said himself issued a response to Huntington in his 2001 article, The Clash of Ignorance, when he argued that Huntington's categorization of the world's fixed so-called civilizations omits the dynamic interdependency and interaction of power and culture. Said argues that the clash of civilizations thesis is an example of, quote, the purest invidious racism, a sort of parody of science directed today against Arabs and Muslims. Said highlights how Huntington's thesis isn't even empirically valid. How do you explain the rise in relations between the US and a country like Saudi Arabia? Or the fact that millions of folks from the Eastern world live, work, and study in Western countries, and vice versa? If I asked you to explain a so-called Western civilization without references to diversity, heterogeneity, and inclusion of all people regardless of background, could you do it? Noam Chomsky has also criticized the concept of the clash of civilizations as being used as a new justification for a host of military interventions carried out by the United States targeting South Asian and Northern African countries, and often justified as necessary after the Cold War, as the Soviet Union was no longer a viable threat. In this way, the global war on terror was the moral panic needed to reassert US dominance in the global hierarchy, and use Eastern cultures as what one might call folk devils. Huntington's thesis was then able to be adopted by governments to provide legitimacy to the claim that cultures of the West and East are incompatible and therefore must be controlled. And stemming from this, as documented by Isla Goal, an important critique of the hegemonic discourses of the so-called War on Terror is growing rapidly against the grain of an overwhelming silence about the impacts of the global war on terror on the non-Western and particularly the Muslim world. The new trend is based on three basic epistemological and ontological assumptions of critical terrorism studies that are not overcome by sociologists studying terrorism, I might add, and that challenge orthodox studies of terrorism. Firstly, the dominance of state-centric perspectives that privilege the Western world and the so-called Western ways of seeing the world as a whole. Second, the preeminence of problem-solving approaches that view terrorism as an objective threat that must be dealt with through a set of interventions. And lastly, the largely ahistorical accounts of terrorism that do not contextualize it within a broader history of international relations, diplomacy, and imperialism. The value of critical terrorism studies, and thus sociology of terrorism, is embedded in the idea of multi-causality, as we talked about in the last video, and the appreciation of complexity in the context of our studies of political violence and terrorism. This explicitly critical approach calls into question asymmetrical power structures of the 21st century by highlighting the uneven distribution of economic, political, and social power between the West and non-Western countries, with the development of globalization and the consequences of an inherently unequal and inequitable social structure. For example, sociologists ask us to question how discourses and practices of terrorism and counter-terrorism, constructed through a Western lens, is inherently embedded in Western ideals, beliefs, and worldviews, and it actually works to create the threat of terrorism itself. For example, there is a large corpus of evidence to support the finding that US foreign policy, military interventions in Middle Eastern countries following 9/11, and the defeat of groups like Al-Qaeda destabilized the region, led to a vacuum of power, and created the social conditions necessary for the development of other terrorist organizations like ISIS. Rather than simply reducing the events of 9/11 to the conclusion that it was committed by a group that holds oppositional views to American ideals, and therefore representing a clash of civilizations, critical sociologists would peel back the onion of how those oppositional views are precipitated, formed, and acted upon. Let me be clear, this is not to be sympathetic with folks who commit violence, but it's the job of the sociologist to gain a keen, robust, and empirically valid understanding of the embedded beliefs, ideologies, practices, and motivations that drive people to do things that we do not ourselves believe in, including those who commit political violence. Gall calls attention to both the explanatory potential of unorthodox views expressed by critical sociologists who challenge the power structures between imperialist powers and those of the Eastern world, and to the necessity of developing alternative knowledge claims that highlight the asymmetrical power relations between Western powers and global resistance to their hegemony. In other words, sociologists can be critical of the stereotyping, stigma, and discrimination embedded in approaching terrorism as a problem out there and predominantly an issue amongst specific cultures. Maryam Khalid offers an even more specific critique of representations of the so-called other in the global war on terror. For Khalid, the Orientalist framework provides a useful critical lens through which we can examine the construction of masculinities and femininities according to race, manipulating and deploying representations of the so-called other to justify military involvement in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. The image of the veiled oppressed Muslim woman and the barbaric male enemy, by example, have played a significant role in war on terror discourse, often used as justifications for military intervention itself. Khalid documents how the burqa and other forms of veiling have been under increased scrutiny, particularly in the context of so-called burqa ban debates in Europe, Canada, and elsewhere. Here the veil and burqa have become prominent, playing a significant role in the construction of so-called Western identity. In War on Terror discourse, the burqa comes to problematically symbolize the non-Western other, which must be excluded, and the danger this so-called other poses to liberal democratic notions of society, and thus supposed Western civilization, where freedom and gender equality is supposed to be valued and endorsed. These discourses rely on long-held assumptions about the alleged helplessness of Eastern women and the misogyny of Eastern men. In the lead-up to the war on Afghanistan, these assumptions were drawn on as the image of the oppressed Muslim woman became highly visible in mainstream news media and official discourse in Europe and North America. A corollary of US military intervention was, so the story goes, to liberate folks from the repressive grips of Eastern cultures. For example, the cover image of the November 2001 edition of Time magazine was typical of the portrayal in the lead up to and during the Afghan war. This particular image featured the title of Lifting the Veil and a story suggesting that the military intervention had freed Afghan women. This image and the accompanied caption is an important example of the ways in which gendered Orientalist knowledge is manipulated to necessitate intervention. Contrasting this with the typical image of the time that represented Muslim men as barbaric, unhuman, and power-hungry enemies, the so-called West is represented as the protagonist in the story of female liberation. Thus, for Khalid, the War on Terror discourse, in ascribing certain masculinities and femininities to male and female others, assigns Orientalist attributes. For example, the promotion of the barbaric versus civilized dichotomy. And these are according to notions of traditional gender roles in which women are protected and men are the protectors. The logic that constructs so-called other women as powerless victims to be saved requires the simultaneous construction of other men as barbaric, uncivilized, and a threat to be contained, as a threat to the supposed Western way of life. Gendered violence thus comes to symbolize what would happen to the Western world if the so-called terrorists win. The civilization that is said to clash with the Western world is framed as threatening to everything liberal democracies stand for. And military intervention becomes not just legitimate, but necessary. The US endorses a masculinist and militaristic solution, but at the same time embodies what Khalid calls a benign paternalism, as the military intervention is accompanied by a benevolent desire to teach people in the supposedly backwards and uncivilized East how to empower themselves. For critical scholars, this was a latent objective of the War on Terror, to create categories of people according to race and gender, defining what men and women, us and them, Arabs and Muslims, as alien others to the Western world. Appealing to women's and human rights discourses, supposedly other women are constructed as being in need of salvation, and other men are demonized and dehumanized. This then allows the US to construct itself by reference to these so-called othered people as morally superior and thus legitimate in pursuing military intervention. And for critical sociologists, this is how alienating and exclusionary logic and ideals manifest in the context of terrorism, and how they, to this day, shape the ways in which the public sphere makes sense of terrorism and the people behind it. The emergence of the notion radicalization is also indicative of this trend. The concept has been typically understood as individual and group transitions away from so-called conventional or status quo political, religious, or ideological beliefs to more extremist views and ultimately violence. It is also a central feature of counter-terrorism strategies, often labeled preventing violent extremism or countering violent extremism. This approach suggests that terrorism is the culmination of a process through which individuals become radicalized away from conventional beliefs through processes of indoctrination, consumption of propaganda or other media messages, groupthink, and social dependence. But as Kunani and I have documented, the very idea of radicalization has been successfully linked to an Orientalist view of terrorism over the past several decades. In other words, radicalization itself has been so embedded with meaning that connects terrorism to specific groups of people or cultures and thus can be easily used as a symbolic placeholder for a very specific kind of terrorism, and thus a very specific kind of person who engages in terrorist activities. If I asked you to close your eyes and think of an image of a so-called radicalized terrorist, what is the first image that comes to mind? If you feel comfortable, drop your answer down in the comment section. Government, mass media, and even scientific experts have advanced the idea that the radicalization process is an objective journey that folks being indoctrinated into the so-called jihadist movements go through. The job of governments is to therefore intervene in that process, identify those who are at risk of becoming radicalized, surveil them, and ultimately intervene in the process by introducing case and social workers, mental health professionals, intelligence officials, or even law enforcement. So beyond just an idea about how folks go from not committing terrorism to ultimately committing it, radicalization has been successfully connected to a host of social control measures that I and a number of scholars have illustrated disproportionately target racialized groups across the Western world. And as Kunani suggests, the concept of radicalization has undoubtedly led to the construction of diverse Muslim populations as the suspect communities for a host of law enforcement strategies that often subject individuals to a variety of civil rights abuses, including illegal surveillance, arbitrary search and seizure, or detention or carding, and even entrapment. For sociologists, the same Orientalist logic that has been propped up by the war on terror at the international level is increasingly embedding itself in social relations domestically and in our local communities. And it's therefore important to critique the nature of such discourses for contributing to false dichotomy that erects barriers and continues to reinforce systematic discrimination against vulnerable racialized groups. But this has also been a point of critique that others have launched against critical scholars who advocate for changes to public and foreign policy. That terrorism is such an existential threat, even though you have a greater risk of being a victim of a bear attack, that we must throw out our ideas of equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and our deep respect for civil liberties and human rights to prevent it. For example, in 2012, following a foiled plot to derail a Via Rail passenger train traveling from Toronto to New York, former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper went on public TV and said that in the context of radicalization, perhaps now is not the time to, as he put it, commit sociology.
Look, I think that in terms of radicalization, this is obviously something we follow. Our security agencies work with each other and with others around the globe to track people who are threats to Canada and to watch threats that may evolve. I think, though, this is not a time to commit sociology, if I can use an expression.
His disregard for the value of social science insight in matters related to counterterrorism challenged scholars interested in exploring the social dynamics of terrorism, and in particular, the numerous counterterrorism interventions which now proliferate our schools, airports, universities, hospitals, religious institutions, and community organizations. Meanwhile, his official evocation of the concept of radicalization as not a time to commit sociology stood out as an assault to the very core of knowledge production processes that might produce rich theories of individual trajectories towards political violence. Aren't pathways to unconventional behaviors and activities quite explicitly in the purview of social scientific discourses that Harper is mocking? Perhaps the former Prime Minister knew that in order to fully understand the complexities involved in any social process towards violence, you need to engage your sociological imagination, and that doing so would lead to policy decisions that do not systematically alienate, exclude, or stigmatize groups of people. Perhaps he saw this as a threat to what Said would call an Orientalist understanding of terrorism, or perhaps not. You can be the judge of that. And I want to be clear, these are empirical questions. They're not moral or political ones. It is not about whether a government official is right or wrong. The question for sociologists is how discourses and practices of terrorism and counterterrorism promote certain ideas, and then to trace the consequence of those ideas. That is what sociologists do. Rather than engaging in morality arguments, They look to answer the how question. It has been 20 years since the events of 9/11, and we can now look back and see how it changed the ways in which we talk about and understand terrorism and counterterrorism at both the domestic and international levels. The much maligned war on terror that is still ongoing today has had lasting effects on the ways in which Western societies interact with the rest of the world. Just as we are grappling with questions about our own complicity in settler colonialism, sociologists call on us to grapple with questions about how terrorism discourses have impacted those most vulnerable to harm, from local to international communities. In this video, we learned about how Orientalist logic and framing has led to the promotion of colonial and imperialist power-knowledge relations that continue to shape global politics, foreign and domestic policy, surveillance and policing strategies, and public perceptions about risk, threat, and prevention strategies. The war on terror has been wildly successful in perpetuating social distinctions between us and a supposed them, and is therefore an important avenue of research for sociologists looking to understand social exclusion, alienation, stigmatization, racism, and inequality. So I hope some questions are percolating for you that remain unanswered and therefore in need of some sociological insight. For your online responses, I want you to think of an example where discourses or practices of terrorism and or counterterrorism contribute to problematic representations of a group or groups of people. How are those people represented? Why were they presented in such a way? And what are the consequences of promoting such representations? So that's it for today. I hope you all learned something about how discourses related to terrorism and practices associated with counterterrorism work to systematically alienate, exclude, and harm already vulnerable racialized groups. We can and should continue to critique the ways in which this social othering manifests both today and into the future. This has been Professor Silva. We'll catch you next time on the Sociology of Terrorism.